Well, hi, everyone. I'm Erin. I'm the Community and Events Manager here at Lattice, and welcome to our webinar today. Today's topic is Mastering the Performance Review Conversation. It's one that we're really excited about, and we're presenting with Torch. So this is a Lattice and Torch webinar. A few things on Zoom just to talk about before we get started. Please mute your microphone if it's not already muted. You can also use the Q&A function, which you'll see down in the bottom of your screen, to submit questions that you'd like our panelists to address at the end. You could also use the chat function to chat either me or the panelists, and I'll sort of be moderating the chat on the bottom right-hand side. Last technical thing, this webinar will be recorded and sent out later to everyone who has registered. So if you can't stay for the whole time, that's totally okay. It'll be sent out this week. And besides that, let's just jump right in. So today we're going to talk about why performance reviews are important. We're going to start and set the scene that way. Everyone does performance reviews, so we're going to talk about why they matter. Second, we're going to talk about setting the right environment for that review. And then we're going to dive into giving and receiving positive feedback, giving and receiving negative feedback, and then creating a follow-up plan from that performance review so everyone is on the same page. So just to get started, I'll intro our speakers today. First is Jack Altman. He's the CEO here at Lattice. And we are a people management platform that helps companies align, grow, and engage employees. We have over 1,000 customers, including Slack, Reddit, Cruise, WeWork, and more. And yeah, that's it. We got one for Jack to speak. And I think, yeah, great. And our other speaker today is Cameron Yarbrough, the founder and CEO of Torch. Torch is a leadership development platform, and it combines software and experienced coaches to empower high performers reach their full potential. And Torch was founded by a senior team of entrepreneurs, executive coaches, and psychologists to sort of disrupt traditional leadership coaching by incorporating both tech and data analytics. We've also actually done a workshop with Torch on giving feedback, and there was such great advice there, so we're really excited to partner with them today. And with that, I think we're going to hand it over to Jack to kick off sort of the meat and bones of the webinar.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Cameron and Torch. We're actually, besides just partners with Torch, we're also customers. We love using it. Coaching has been super effective for us. So we're really grateful to be doing this webinar with such an awesome partner who does so much. So Cameron, I'm excited to do this with you today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you and with Lattice.
All right. So to get started, we're going to talk about why performance reviews are important. Like, why should we do them at all? What's the value? Obviously, any of us who have worked at a company, been through performance reviews, we know they can be difficult. They can be challenging conversations. They take up a lot of time. So what's the point? Why should we do this? So the first thing to acknowledge is that these take a lot of hours. Your managers who have very limited time already are going to spend a lot of time on this. And it's important to see if that time is well spent. It's important to use these reviews to their full potential. So you want to make sure that if you're going to go through the process of doing performance management, which of course you should, it's extremely valuable. We'll sort of argue today that it's in fact critical if you want to run a great company. You need to use that time wisely, because it's going to be a lot of time for your managers, for the employees, and even for your team to administer. So it's really important that you do it. And it is the case, though, that performance reviews do drive performance. So you can, there's statistics that show this. Obviously, we have a couple here that support it. But reviews are an important part of performance because they set goals. They help you sort of set the time where you're setting expectations, where you're looking back at what you've done in the past, where you have a moment to sort of reflect and not just be caught up in the day-to-day. And, if you think about sort of the quadrants of urgent but important, urgent and unimportant, the sort of just like long-term important things and sort of how pressing these are. Performance reviews are one of these things that are not urgent. We're all pulled into so many more things in our day-to-day, but they're so critical to our growth, to our development, that we need to do this. It's a lot like going to the gym. We talk about this a lot, but this is one of those things where in the moment it's difficult, in the moment it takes time and effort, it can be uncomfortable, but we do it because it's good for us. We do it because in the long run, it breeds a healthy culture. It helps employees grow. It keeps people aligned. And so it's worth it. And so some of what we need to do as people ops practitioners is to sort of champion the value of it. We need to, with our companies, with our leadership teams, to get people bought into why this is such an important thing to do. So one of the things we always recommend when we're sort of rolling out performance management with companies is even more important than the actual process and the structure is the cultural understanding that feedback cultures matter, that they're valuable, that they're not just what make companies successful, they're not just what make employees successful, but they're also what make cultures healthy and vibrant, that make it a pleasant place to work. And so if you get that buy-in, the rest becomes a lot easier. So now I want to switch over to talking about how to set the stage for these conversations, which can be difficult, which can be emotional. So Cameron, I want to ask you, how should we go about setting the stage to have productive feedback conversations?
So I think what's most important is to really is how you frame it to yourself. I like to frame a performance conversation as an opportunity for transformation. Right. This is going to be a conversation that is a tremendous opportunity for personal growth. So whether you're the manager or whether you're the direct report, what you bring to this conversation is going to determine what you ultimately get out of it. So, whether it's if I'm receiving feedback, I want to work on being non-defensive, for example. I want to work on being non-defensive, but I do have boundaries, meaning I'm not open to being abused by my manager. I'm not going to be a recipient of personal criticism, for example. But what I am going to be open to is constructive feedback that's going to help me be a better person in the workplace and a higher performer, right? So as I prepare for a performance review conversation, whether it's the manager or the employee, really it's about my personal work of being psychologically prepared for the moment. Ultimately, being a great manager means that you need to be a great people person. I've seen it all the time in my career where you can have an incredible software engineer. You take the best software engineer in the world, and that person may not have great people skills, and he or she will have to work on it. Right? So being a great manager is very different from being an individual contributor, even if you're at the very, very top of your craft in the world as an IC, right? Being a manager is a new skill. It requires that you motivate people to positively perform at their best in the workplace. It also means that you have to set very, very high standards without alienating people. Right? These are very, very hard things to do on an interpersonal level. So yes, being a great manager actually means being a very, very skilled people person.
Totally. And that's a really interesting question that comes up when you've got a great individual contributor, maybe it's a salesperson, maybe it's an engineer, and then you're considering promoting them into a manager. And that can be one of the most interesting decisions to work through.
But the beauty of it is that these things can be learned, right? So there's very little curriculum out there in the world. You don't get it in undergrad. You don't get it in business school. To be a people person, oftentimes that's learned in people's families. It's learned in friendship communities. It's maybe learned from a great mentor or a coach or a therapist. But the fact is these are skills that can be learned. It's not like something that you're either born with or born without. It's like learning any skill or exercising your body. It's something that you can work on and get better at.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a great transition to the next slide, which is that preparation is a learnable thing. It's something that as a manager, there's skills that can be taught, that can be studied and learned. And as an employee as well, there's things that we can do to prepare. So for example, one thing that's really important, I think, around performance reviews is eliminating surprises. You don't want the performance review to be a surprise. And the key to that is continuous feedback throughout the year. So let's say I've got a performance review coming up in July, and I've never told somebody that, for example, they're always late with their projects. And then for the first time in July, I'm going to lay this on them. Well, it would have been much more productive as a manager if I had communicated that along the way. You want to sort of deliver feedback as you see it in chunks. It's going to be much more effective. Similarly, it's things like tangible examples. That's another really important skill that doesn't come actually so naturally, I find, for a lot of people in the workplace, because, if you haven't sort of done this before, you might translate from your personal life to your work life. And in your personal life, you aren't jotting down examples of the way that interpersonal relationships go. And if someone did something as a friend that you found sort of a little off-putting, most of us are not writing down and documenting and sharing those examples back. But in a professional context, it's actually really effective. Cameron, I don't know if you've seen sort of that thing around examples and the power there.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's really important not to shock people, right? And that's what you're saying, Jack, right? Is if somebody is hearing this feedback for the very, very first time, it's very possible that as a manager that you're coming in a little bit too late with the feedback. In worst case scenarios, people get fired and they say, what? I never heard that feedback before. I had no idea I wasn't hitting my goals or hitting expectations. You see this all the time where employees are shocked by the fact that they're either being reprimanded or they're being fired, and they've never been given the feedback before. So as a great manager, that should never happen.
Yeah, and an interesting twist on this that I've actually seen is, because as a manager, we're told just what we said, that you don't want to surprise people. What I've seen happen before is you'll actually go a few months without delivering feedback. And then as a manager, you realize, man, if I say this, I'll be surprising the person. And so we hold it even longer. And then people will go into this whole thing where they're just afraid to talk about this thing. And so better late than never, for sure. And so, you do want to deliver that feedback, even if you're a little bit late on it. You just want to try to not get there in the first place.
One thing, and also to add, is that what can happen is if I start to store up, say it's negative feedback, and I start to really store that up, and then it stockpiles inside of me emotionally to where I get really tense and I'm upset about it, but I haven't told the employee about it. What can then happen is then when I go to deliver the feedback, I can miscue it, meaning I can give the feedback with too much emphasis or too much rigidity, right? So if it's sort of like a dam, if you let little bits of that water, squirts of that water out over time, then there's less pressure. So that when you finally release that dam, it's not coming out in a massive storm. It's coming out in a more regulated way. And so think of your own psychology and your own emotional regulation as an important part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this also leads to another sort of important question, which is the employee is often very tempted or interested in sharing feedback at the same time. Sometimes this is because this is just the venue, and when you're a manager and you have sat down and maybe you've given each other a review, you sit down to this performance conversation, and there's a lot of temptation to go both directions, and maybe that's productive, maybe it's not, maybe there's ways for it to be productive, maybe there's ways for it to be unproductive. So Cameron, question for you, in a performance review, is this a appropriate forum for an employee to give feedback to the manager? If so, how? If not, why?
So I think that they are, and I think it should be, it's the manager's responsibility to frame it that way, is really this is an opportunity for us to work on our relationship. And I think it doesn't need to be taken separately, right? So if I'm the manager, I'm going to bracket out a portion of the time is going to be about giving you your feedback. And then a portion of that time is going to be bracketed for us working on our relationship, right? And I think the tendency is to avoid explicitly talking about our working relationship because that can be a little bit uncomfortable. But what I'm going to do in a performance review conversation is I'm going to bracket time, and I'm going to specifically say, now this is an opportunity for us to work on our relationship together. And part of that means that I'm going to be open to feedback from you about how I can be a better manager. It's a give and it's a take.
Yeah, I love that concept because, we certainly at Lattice recommend both directions. We certainly recommend that employees give managers feedback in a review and managers give employees feedback. But the thing that you added that I really love is that there should also be space not to talk about the employee or the manager as individuals, but to actually talk about that relationship, which is its own sort of living and breathing entity. I think not enough people do that. So those were some kind of context setting bits But now I'm very excited to talk a little bit more about kind of the meat of what we're here for today, which is giving and receiving feedback. So we're going to start by talking about giving and receiving positive feedback, and then we'll go over to giving and receiving negative feedback. So these are sort of four very connected concepts, the giving and the receiving of both the positive and the negative feedback. They're similar, but they all have sort of unique aspects to them, and we're going to try to tease those out here in these sort of next part of this presentation here. What we're starting with is a framework that I've heard Cameron share. He actually shared it with our team maybe 5 or 6 months ago, and people just loved it. And so Cameron, I'm excited for you to do this this next slide to sort of kind of set the framing for how we might even think about how feedback is going to come out.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite frameworks, and it's very much what we at Torch are trying to help our customers create at their own organizations. And I'm aware that Jack at Lattice is also a big believer and holds this as a company value too. What we're ultimately trying to do is create high love, high structure organizations. And here's where this comes from. So back in the 1980s, there was a whole body of longitudinal studies on youth in the juvenile justice system. And what behavioral scientists were trying to understand is what were the family conditions that landed some children in juvenile justice systems while others went on to become high-performing individuals. And what they ultimately constructed was this simple 2x2 matrix around structure on the x-axis and love on the y-axis. So here's where that's coming from. The concept is that in a family system, you have to have structures, meaning there's expectations around getting good grades, there's getting home on time, there's going to bed on time, there's maybe table manners, clear structures that let me internalize as a child what it is to be a productive member of my family, okay? That involves boundaries and it involves expectations. On the love side, that's where all the warmth is, the empathy, the connection, intimacy, positivity, right? And what behavioral scientists found is that we actually need both of those things in order to be very high functioning people. And so when you apply this framework to organizations, it really holds, right? So high love, high structure organizations are organizations that hold and retain their employees through thick and thin, but they also create high performance by putting those structures in place. A performance review conversation is a perfect example of a structure, right? By contrast, low love, low structure organizations, those are organizations where you're going to have a lot of churn because there's a lot of negativity, right? And or at least complete lack of positive feedback. And then low structure means not clear expectations around what goals and targets are, right? I think it's very common in Silicon Valley too that you'll see high structure, low love organizations. There's lots of examples of very high functioning organizations that have high structure and low love. But interestingly, what happens is you'll notice as soon as things are great when everything is moving up and to the right, but as soon as those organizations start to fail or they're not hitting their goals or there's some major problem, those organizations see major employee churn, okay? So think of it that way. So you can be a high structure, low organization, but you sure as better make sure that everything is always going up and to the right. And then my last piece around this is for all you parents out there. Think of it this way. The way that you manage is going to inevitably influence the way that you parent and vice versa. So you can get away with building a high structure, low love organization because things are moving up and to the right, but know that that's also going to influence your personal life. Jack, thoughts?
I mean, I love this framework. I have 2 questions. One is, so we talked about these kind of high love, high structure or other sort of permutations in the context of the organization. Is it important to know what sort of family structure people are from? Is that something employees and managers should talk about? I'm actually from, for example, a high love, low structure family. And because of that, I might act this way. And you should know that about me in the same way it's useful to know if I'm introverted or extroverted, for example. Is it one of those types of things?
It's such a brilliant question because yes, the unconscious is very, very powerful, right? And so what you're naturally going to bring into your management style is likely going to be informed by the type of family organization that you came from. This is why I always say that self-awareness is so important, right? So doing enough work on yourself so you can identify, okay, so for example, I came from a high structure, low love family system. It's very important for me to have that, maintain that awareness, because where I sometimes can get stuck and where I'll get negative feedback from my employees is around not giving enough positive feedback or being generous enough with compliments, right? And I think it's hard to admit that. It feels painful for me to admit that to myself, but that's what self-awareness is. And yes, Jack, so do that work on yourself so that you know what you're bringing into your management style organically.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because just for me, I'm from high love, low structure. And I think that does sort of translate into the way I am, in my work as well. So that makes sense. And then I guess the only other question I had, and then we can go into the next section, is it always the case that high love, high structure is best? Or are there times where, for example, high love, low structure might be appropriate? For example, if you're a startup or if you're highly creative, or does structure not mean constraint? Is structure always a positive thing?
So look, I'm a big believer in both. So my bias is that I think that those structures have to be in place. Otherwise, for example, employees might feel lost. They don't know what they're going to be measured against. And that can be scary and create uncertainty for an employee, right? I can have fear that I'm going to be reprimanded for something, and that expectation was never set for me, right? So I actually find that employees will oftentimes feel safer in an organization in which the structures are clear, because now I know how I'm going to be measured, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
And then high love. I mean, come on. I'm absolutely biased there. I'm a big believer in a combination of high performance and expectations that create that, but also an organization that is kind, that is empathic, that is warm and congratulatory.
Absolutely. And you and I have talked about this too, that regardless of whether, a high love environment leads to better business results, which we believe it does, even if you put that aside, it's just more pleasant to be part of. So that's good enough reason. All right. So this is an important topic. So as part of the giving and receiving of feedback, I've learned a lot about this from the coaching that I actually have with Torch. But Cameron, what is active listening? How do we do it?
So active listening is, I think, the most important kind of home base for any manager. And what that means is when you go into a performance review conversation, you have to be prepared to listen. If you're an employee that is going into a review conversation, it's incredibly helpful to use active listening to let your manager know that you're hearing them, right? So here's what active listening is. Active listening, first of all, involves the ability to use these and less of this, right? So the ratio is, well, we have 2 of these and 1 of these. So imagine that you consider that you're going to use a 2-to-1 ratio of the amount of time that you're actually listening versus talking, right? So active listening means that I'm going to be using my ears, and I'm going to be letting someone kind of share with me what they want to share with me. But it is also very tactical in that I'm going to repeat back the key points that person shares with me before I add my spin or any justification. So, for example, if Jack says something, Jack, give me a quick line of feedback.
Cameron, it seems like you have some really beautiful trees behind you, and I just wanted to say that's I think a really great thing. So, okay, Jack. So what I heard you say was that there's some trees behind me, and they're on the wall. They're an homage to Tahoe, which is where I'm actually heading after this webinar, and you're noting and you're appreciating the trees. Yeah, no, I appreciate the trees. I think they add a lot.
What I did was I repeated back, but I slightly tweaked it, right? I didn't say it wasn't an identical parroting back of what Jack said. Active listening means that I'm taking in what he's saying, and then I'm modifying it only slightly, and then I'm giving it back to him, such that he really knows that I heard him, right?
I think one important note here is that, of course, if you have a conversation with somebody and they say, hey, I noticed X, and you repeat back, I think what you're telling me is that you noticed X, that's not going to be the most sort of fluid of conversations. And so you want to take this concept and you still want to have a very normal and human conversation.
Yes.
Because of, the other side is you're going to get the opposite effect if you sort of act robotic in this sense. But it is really important to, in a natural way, reiterate back what you heard before you react, particularly in cases where it's, highly sort of positive or negative or emotional or things like that.
Yeah. So let's try it one more time, Jack. Give me something else that I can kind of role play it a little bit more. Maybe say you saw me surfing and you're giving me feedback about my surfing.
Yeah. So Cameron, I was watching from the beach when you were surfing the other day, and I noticed that every time a big wave came, it seemed like instead of riding the wave, you kind of went to the side, and it looked like you were maybe scared of sort of going out for the big challenge.
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually a really good one. So what you noticed when you're watching was that I was watching the bigger set waves come in, and I was sort of paddling around them as opposed to trying to catch them. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for noticing that. And the truth is I was actually feeling a little bit scared. I haven't been surfing as much lately now that I've been running my startup. And so when bigger waves come in, I get a little bit anxious, right? So that's how I'm notice the active listening isn't my repeating back, but there's a way to do it that's very organically that lets Jack know that I very much heard his statement. And most importantly, when he noticed that, or he was imagining that I might be scared, I repeated that back too, right?
So yeah, so this is great. Active listening is super critical on the receiving end, but there's also a bunch of stuff that you can do on the giving end that can make it more effective. So Cameron, when you're giving positive feedback, what do you try to keep in mind?
When I'm giving positive feedback, is again back to my family system. First of all, I'm gonna kind of check in with myself, and I'm just gonna notice that I came from a high structure, low love family system. So there wasn't. In my family, people weren't just always giving positive feedback. It was just sort of the expectation that you would get A's, right? And that was just sort of table stakes, okay? So what I'm gonna notice is that sometimes I can get a little bit uncomfortable when I'm giving somebody positive feedback, right? So I have to be very thoughtful and very conscious and almost sort of like walk myself through it ahead of time. And the other thing is I know that I need to practice it a lot. So I'm constantly giving people positive feedback. And the more that I do it, to be totally honest with you, the more that I do it, the easier it gets. And then it actually starts to feel really natural and doesn't feel scripted. So go ahead. Jack, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So then I guess on the other side, on the receiving of positive feedback, what are sort of the top tips that you kind of have for that sort of thing?
Again, same thing. You'd be surprised at how many people deflect positive feedback, right? It is so common that you'll give someone positive feedback, and what they'll say is either, oh, they'll give the positive feedback to someone else. They'll say, oh, that was because Sarah did such a great job on X, Y, and Z, right? I'm not going to really take that in, or they'll say, oh, thanks, and they'll just change the subject really fast, right? So it is oftentimes very difficult for someone to take in positive feedback. And what I oftentimes will say is, if someone if someone is giving me positive feedback, I do two things. First of all, my first thing is I breathe. I pause and I just breathe, and I sort of just take it in without saying anything. I'm just kind of breathing in that positive feedback. And then I say, thank you for saying that. And then I might do an active listening. Like, thank you for saying that, Jack. I really appreciate being recognized for that. Feels really good. So
that's great. One of the things I also always say to people when they receive it, because most people are humble and don't, being the center of attention can sometimes be uncomfortable, and maybe you do want to recognize other people, or maybe you sort of just want to sort of move on to the next topic. But if it's substantive positive feedback, just like when someone gives you critical feedback, and it's important to sort of dig for that next thing and really understand what they're saying, which we'll talk about sort of in this next section. When you receive positive feedback, it's actually equally important. So if we got off of this webinar and Cameron, you sent me a note and you said, Jack, you did, an unbelievably good job on the webinar. I could either say, oh, stop, thanks, that's, it's too kind. Or I could say, I really appreciate that. What do you think was good about it that I could, remember to do next time? And then you'll say, well, the way you framed the questions, or the way you did the Q&A, or whatever it was, and then I can ask one more question. And then I know what you mean, rather than just having the positive feelings, which I'll get anyway, and I'll sort of have that sort of warm fuzzy from that. But I'll also know specifically what you meant, and it's much more useful to me.
That's a perfect thing to add. What you're saying is you'll respond to me with an open-ended question and say, hey, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Feels good to hear. Could you be more specific about what it is that you really liked?
Yeah, that's right. And then if I want to, I can kind of iterate that until we get to a detail, or keep it at, a medium level, and it can be really productive. All right, so now I'm going to go over to the other side. And before we talk about this, I want to start with the negative feedback section with this quote. This is from Patty McCord, saying that part of being an adult is being able to hear the truth, and the corollary is that you owe the adults you hired the truth. That's actually what they want most from you. So when it comes to giving and receiving negative feedback, I think that quote is so important to hold close to your heart, that it's really a gift. So the positive feedback feels good. And if Cameron tells me that I did something well on this webinar, I'll feel good about it, and I'll try to remember it for next time. But the critical feedback is more useful. The critical feedback is where more of the growth happens, where we can make more improvement. It of course comes at the trade-off, which is that it can be quite uncomfortable. It can be difficult to receive. It's difficult to give, but it really is a gift. And so what I love about the quote from Patty McCord, and we've heard this from many others too, is that it's not just a gift to give to people, but it should almost be thought of as an obligation. I think part of the commitment when you hire somebody, or when you have them join your team, even if you're not their manager, is that there's a mutual understanding that you're going to help each other grow. So nobody's in a better position to help one another grow in their careers, in their sort of work abilities, than the people who work with them every day. And so if you're one of the people who works most closely with somebody, you're in the position of being most able to give useful, critical feedback. And if you don't do it, then nobody will. And so, it actually, I think, should be thought of as an obligation of a manager, that you say what you see and what you think can be helpful. And of course, you use all of these techniques to do it. But even imperfect critical feedback is better than no feedback. Obviously, really well constructed feedback is better. But all of everything we've said in this webinar aside, I still think that it's more important that you give the critical feedback and do your very best, and you improve at giving that critical feedback, but giving it at all is so important. So Cameron and I are going to do a little role play here to give examples of what it's like when you're giving negative feedback and you aren't doing the things that we have on this slide here that are important. So being specific, focusing on behaviors, and avoiding hyperbole. We're going to show an example of what it's like when you do these things and when you don't do these things, just to show you, and hopefully it'll be relatable, and of course it'll be a little bit staged, but hopefully it will spark examples of conversations that you've had where you'll remember, oh yeah, when I do those things, I do get a slightly different reaction here. So here we go.
So the most important kind of key to thinking about how to give negative feedback is, in a negative feedback conversation, what you're trying to do is manage defensiveness, right? So if you're the manager, then what you're trying to do is frame it in ways that are going to elicit less defensiveness from someone. And then if you're the employee, it's a matter of really working on just opening up and seeing the negative feedback as a learning opportunity and working to kind of take it in, as opposed to getting, people oftentimes will listen to react rather than listen to respond. And so as an employee, what you're trying to do is listen to understand and respond. Okay, so here are three really important things to think about when it comes to negative feedback that will help you avoid defensiveness. So one is to be really specific in your feedback as opposed to generalized. Okay, so here's an example. Jack, I was looking at our sales targets for the quarter, and what occurs to me is that we really need to be hitting our sales targets.
Yeah, no, absolutely, we do. So, the whole sales team definitely needs to do a better job of getting there. It's really important.
Now, I'm kind of stuck because what I really wanted Jack to understand was that he wasn't hitting his sales targets, and by making it generalized, by using the we instead of I term, what I did was I gave him an out. He could defer responsibility, right? And he could easily be defensive, right? So now I'm going to try it in a different way. Jack, I was looking at our sales targets for the quarter, and we're tracking at about 80%. And what really occurs to me is that you aren't hitting the targets that we agreed to. And I really want to say, Jack, I really need you to ramp it up, and I really need you to hit your sales targets for the quarter.
Yeah, well, I guess you're right. I know how important those sales numbers are, and yeah, I guess I guess you're right. My numbers aren't where I want them to be, so I will try to do what I can to make it better.
So notice what I do as I move from we, right, which is a generalized term, to here's my expectation for you.
Yeah, and naturally in a real world situation, even with the great way that Cameron framed it, when you're telling somebody that they're below expectations, people are naturally going to get defensive. So you'll still have to manage through that, but it's going to be so much healthier if you're at least clear about what you mean, rather than saying we need to hit our sales numbers, and then the person on the other side says, yeah, well, you're right, we do. Where now this person has sort of skirted the issue, you haven't said what you want, passive aggressiveness can creep in. So much healthier to be specific and direct with those things.
So our next one is around managing behaviors as opposed to attitudes. And the problem with managing attitudes is that an attitude is something that happens inside of someone's internal world. And because I'm not psychic, I actually don't know what is happening inside of someone's internal world. So if I try to manage against someone's attitude, I'm likely to be wrong, and I'm likely to get a defensive person. So here's an example. Jack, when you came late to our webinar prep meeting, it was just obvious that you really didn't care that much.
I don't know why. I mean, I care so much. I really value our partnership, and I care a ton about everything that we're talking about. So, I was really busy, but I definitely care.
So the assumption that I made was met with defensive because, in fact, I don't know what's happening in Jack's inner world. And so let me try it in a different way and see what happens. Jack, the other day when you came late to our webinar prep meeting, I noticed that you walked in the door, at around 10 minutes past, and you were looking at your phone, and you kind of sat in a chair, kind of off the edge of the table. And I just wanted to check in with you about that.
Well, yeah, I was late, but I've been really stressed, and I haven't been sleeping well, and I've been behind in all my meetings lately. So this webinar means a lot to me, and I really care about everything we're talking about. But I was, I've had a bad week, and I've been running behind on a lot of stuff. So I'm sorry about that. So now,
by the way, Jack was not late to our webinar prep, but for the role play, the way that I framed it the second time around, I know what I did was I named his behaviors as he walked in, and then I gave him space to respond authentically, with what was happening inside of his inner world, which was he's really stressed and he's really overwhelmed. And now I have all this additional data because I didn't make an assumption about his attitude. What I did was I just named the behavior and then I asked an open-ended question. So the next one is around avoiding hyperbole, and these are like you always and you nevers, right? And it's you will absolutely, there's my hyperbole, you will absolutely create defensiveness in people if you use hyperbole too much. And so here would be an example. Jack, you never hit your sales targets. Every single quarter we have this conversation, and every single time it's the same. You never hit your sales targets.
Never hit my sales targets. I hit my sales target just 7 quarters ago. I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, so here's the problem with managing by hyperbole. With hyperbole, there's generally going to be some exceptions, right? It's hard to do. You have to actually train yourself. There are going to be times when Jack did hit his sales targets, and so the easy thing for him to do is get defensive with me and name the exception, right? So now I'm going to say it differently. Jack, we've had this conversation a number of times, and what I've noticed is that you oftentimes are missing your sales targets. I think there's been a couple times when you have hit, but you're often missing your sales targets.
Well, I guess that's true. I'm always trying hard to get there, and I definitely have, but I know you're right that this quarter, and there was a quarter a few times ago that I missed. So you're right.
So those are some kind of key, I think, important takeaways for how to deliver negative feedback in a way that's going to be met with less defensiveness. The one piece that's not on here that I do want to add that's really important for the manager, when you step into the conversation to deliver negative feedback, is you've got to manage your own emotions. You've got to manage your own your own kind of your own fears, your own anxiety, such that when you're delivering the negative feedback, that it comes across in a moderated tone, that it's not too loud, it's not too tense, it's not too rigid. So that's the one piece, the flavor of all of this, is that it needs to be delivered in a medium way.
Yeah, and the one other thing, and I'm going to go quickly on this just because I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A, but this is something that you've talked about a lot that I find very helpful, is that also focusing on how behaviors make you feel rather than your exact interpretation of what the behaviors is really important. So, I mean, you did this in your examples in the past, but things like saying, when you're late, it makes me feel like you don't care, as opposed to when you're late, it means you don't care. And so that framing and that sort of softening of the feedback is important. So figuring out how to be direct, but appropriately measured is going to be critical.
The roots of that is in the I message, right? When this behavior happened, I felt this emotion. It's called an I message.
100%. Yeah, focusing on yourself and the reaction that you have is so valuable. That's a very practical one that I've used all the time, and it makes a huge difference. So just to sort of summarize here, Cameron, do you want to kind of wrap up this section for us?
Yeah, so see the opportunity to give to either give or receive negative feedback as an opportunity to grow. What you're trying to do is establish boundaries, which an example of a boundary is setting a clear expectation for what it is that you want, and then manage by addressing behaviors, and then asking clarifying questions to understand where that employee is coming from. Those are the kind of key takeaways. And then manage your own psychology and your own emotionality.
Yeah, those are all great. And then one other really cool thing, I think, is going into the deltas between what you saw in yourself and then what your manager shared about you. That's where I think there's so much sort of juice to squeeze from these conversations of when you're completely aligned, and when the manager believes that you've done a very good job at X, and you also believe that you've done a very good job at X. That's great. You can talk about it, but you're on the same page about it. Or even if it's negative, even if you think you need to improve on Y, and this is what you need to do, and your manager thinks the same thing, that's great. It's good to have those conversations. It means good communication happened, or you're on the same page. What's really interesting is when there's a substantial delta between what I think about myself. So maybe I think I'm a really clear communicator, but I'm hearing from my manager or my peers that communicating is actually often really difficult for me and that they don't always understand my intentions. That's really interesting because if we agreed, then we could sort of work through it from there. But when it's different, we actually need to find out why we feel that difference. I know that's super valuable. And what's cool actually is in the 360 that you do in Torch, this is actually one of their features where you can see what you thought about yourself, what the people around you thought about you. I always found that those are sort of the most valuable parts of a 360 exercise.
Right. What we're trying to do is see where our blind spots are. We all have them and we need to identify them. And in order to see our blind spots, we have to ask for feedback, right? So how I see myself versus how I see versus how others see me.
Yeah, absolutely. So after we have a performance review, then what? This is similar to a lot of people ops processes that we do at our companies, whether it's an engagement survey and then what, or a performance review and then what, or we set goals and then what. The key to getting ongoing buy-in from your teams and to deriving the value from all of the work that you put into all of these sort of different things that we do is that there's some follow-up. So we don't run an engagement survey and then do nothing. Otherwise, why would we run the engagement survey? And if employees see that you don't follow up on the engagement survey, they're not going to want to fill out the next one. Similarly, if we do performance reviews and then there's nothing that we do from there, that doesn't feel very good for people either. And so what we want to do is have some sort of follow-up plan between the employee and the manager of what are the areas where we can improve, and either as the employee, you know what you want to do yourself to improve, or you're not sure how you can improve and you want to work with your manager on the next steps that you're going to take together. But that conversation should be an ongoing one. And so one of the things that is very effective is following up in person. You might get feedback from, your manager, your peers, a direct report. Maybe you'll have a conversation, hopefully, if it's your manager, but you also are going to have feedback from people in a 360 that you're not necessarily going to have a sit-down meeting with. But if you're not sure about something, particularly in cases like where there's a delta, following up in person is really valuable, that you can sort of get the context, that you can have a space to sort of match the tone of what you're saying to the content of what you're saying. So really highly recommend those. The other thing for managers is to sort of recap the whole review in a digestible chunk. So depending on how you run your performance review cycles, there might be quite a lot of content. There might be 3 or 5 questions from a bunch of different reviewers. It can be a lot to digest, and you'll sort of pull out little bits and pieces, and you'll be able to process it. But one thing as a manager that you can do is very effective is to summarize, to digest the whole thing and to try to synthesize with the employee, or maybe before and then again after the meeting with the employee, what's sort of the recap, what's the high level, can be a really important thing. So you kind of want to find these areas of improvement and then create a follow-up plan. So what are the things that we're going to do? What are the actual specific areas that we can improve on? Is it combinations of how we talk with a different team and how we work with our own team? Is it getting more knowledge? And if so, what are the ways that we can go out and get more knowledge? Is it a communication style that we need to improve to be more effective in our roles? And if so, what are the things that we can do or practice to get better at communicating? So finding those areas and then finding follow-up plans is a really valuable thing. So I guess to summarize, and then we've still got 8 or 10 minutes here for Q&A. Number one is that performance reviews are uncomfortable, but this critical feedback is essential for growing careers, for improving your companies, and for having a healthy culture. The second takeaway is that productive feedback conversations require active listening. So this is what Cameron was telling us about, where you hear what they said, you repeat it back to them in a sort of very human way, you maybe add a little bit of more context, and then you establish that you understood the person before you react and sort of respond yourself. The third thing is giving equal weight to positive and negative feedback, so that we don't just do one or the other. We don't want to have a culture where it's only high fives and thumbs up. We also don't want to have a culture where it's all critical and no one's getting recognition. So having both of these and equipping your employees with the ability to effectively give and receive both types of feedback, really, really important. And then finally, following up on all this work that you did. So a lot of effort goes into these conversations, these performance reviews. you want to make sure that people follow through on areas that they can improve, that managers see it as their responsibility to help their employees kind of follow through on those different improvement areas, and that there's a regular conversation around that stuff. Cameron, do you have anything you wanted to add before we go to the Q&A?
I think that's a great recap. Just, managing your own psychology and your own emotionality when you go into the meeting, so you're not tightening up so much, right? And then, delivering feedback on an ongoing way, such that, you're not storing it all up and then kind of miscuing it when you go in.
Perfect. All right, so now we have a little bit of time for Q&A here. So I see there's a bunch of questions in here already. If you want to add more, we'll start going through these now. And then hopefully also after the webinar, we'll be able to answer a few more of these. If you want to send more messages to either of us, we'll obviously share our contact information. But to get started, Cameron, I'll give the first one to you. The question is, how do we prep managers to ensure that employees are clear on the feedback they're getting? So in other words, we want to avoid this mixed message that, we want managers to be really supportive and to do all these, kind of helpful things to create an environment where people feel comfortable and welcome and positive, but you're also asking us to be critical and direct and to confront challenges. How do I, from a messaging perspective, how do I sort of give both sides of that context effectively?
So in the context of a performance review, what is expected is both positive and negative feedback, right? So you can choose to start with the positive feedback and go through it very, very clearly, and then follow it up with the negative feedback. And the tone should adjust accordingly to the positive feedback and the negative feedback. I mean, look, the most important truth here is that positivity and negativity are not mutually exclusive, right? It is important to deliver. It is a gift to deliver both of them in a moderated and regulated way. So that's how I contextualize that.
Great. All right, so this is a question that's for either of us. The question is, if a manager asks for career goals or aspirations, what are the important things to cover? Is there a template? How do you tell a story about what you aspire to learn? This is a great question, and I do really recommend that managers know people's career goals and aspirations. I think as a manager, knowing not just what your employee is trying to accomplish this month or this quarter, or even in the context of your company, but knowing what your employees' longer term career aspirations, I think that's actually a really important part of being a good manager. Like, I think that one of your sort of duties as a manager, and I do see management as a duty to the people on your team. I see, I think servant leadership is a great framework for how to think about management. I do think that you need to know the context of what these employees, the people on your team aspire to. I don't personally have or know of a great template. I know that human conversations and just having the type of relationship with employees where you can ask that sort of question and it doesn't feel uncomfortable, in my experience, has been enough. Cameron, I don't know if you have anything that you've seen work in the past for this.
There's a Kim Scott in her book Radical Candor offers a really cool framework for this, and she frames it as rock stars and superstars. And so what she says is you need to understand which of your employees want to be rock stars and which want to be superstars. Superstars are people who always want more responsibility and they always want to be leveling up in the organization. And ultimately they're going to want maybe more responsibility and move on from your organization in order to keep leveling up. You have to motivate those people with giving them bigger and bigger and new challenges and let them level up in order to retain them. And then rock stars, by contrast, are people who just want to be the best at their craft. They're not necessarily interested in taking on more responsibility or leveling up in title. They just want to be the best software engineer in the world, for example. And you really need to motivate that person differently than the way that you motivate a superstar. Really helpful for me to understand that.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I think in general, as a manager, you should think that it's your job to manage accordingly to what the person's needs are in terms of their style, their level. their experience is, what they're aspiring to. And so I think the more individual context you have as a manager will allow you to sort of adapt with different employees so that you're treating people in ways that are most effective for sort of their satisfaction and performance. All right, I think we can do one or two more here. One question is, in terms of being able to respond and receive critical feedback, can you talk about how to create a safe environment? So at the company level, how do we create an environment overall in the culture where people can give and receive critical feedback comfortably? Cameron, do you want to start?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples of toxic workplace cultures. They'll take even something like radical candor, and they'll say, well, in the spirit of radical candor, you're a jerk. And I'm exaggerating there, but people can abuse, for example, the whole concept of giving negative feedback, and they can sort of imbue it with criticism and attack, right? And so I think it's really important to set those kind of leadership standards where you're saying we actually don't tolerate that at this organization. We don't tolerate toxicity around, and toxicity is either personal criticism, attack, insults, passive aggression. These types of kind of toxic behaviors need to be named. They need to be called out. Those people need to be moved out of the organization. And when you're hiring new staff, it's really important to hire people based on those kind of cultural frameworks and set the expectations with people in the interview process.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the only thing I would add is I think at the company leadership level, it's really important to make clear that it's okay to fail at things, that it's okay not to be perfect at everything all the time, and that it's actually a great sign of growth when people are working on things that are difficult or challenging for them, so that people know that failure is okay and it's actually even celebrated in a certain way. Obviously, we want to succeed at things, but if we're never trying things that we're not quite able to do, it means we're not stretching enough, and we're not attempting enough, and we're not growing fast enough. And so I think setting an expectation at the company level and sort of as a people team working with leadership to make sure that that is communicated, I think that goes a long way to making people comfortable with critical feedback, and knowing that just because something needs to get better doesn't mean we failed. It actually means that we are ambitiously trying to grow as individuals, and you can kind of really flip that on its head. All right, so right at the end of the hour here, and we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. So we're really grateful that you joined us for this. Obviously, you know how to reach out to both of us. We'll be sharing contact information. You can follow each of us on Twitter. You can email us. We'd love to talk to you. We really hope to see you again.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Lattice, and thank you to all of our viewers.